You're sitting on a folding wooden chair on the dirt floor of the central pavilion of the People's Temple Agricultural Project, Jonestown, northwestern Guyana, on the late afternoon of November 18th, 1978. It is 26 minutes past 5 in the evening. There are 909 people in the pavilion with you. 204 of them are children. Your 3 children are among them. Your wife is among them. Your mother is among them. The man on the wooden stage in front of you is named James Warren Jones. He is 47 years old. He is wearing a faded red short-sleeved shirt and dark sunglasses. He is sweating. There is, on a small folding table beside him, a 55-gallon stainless steel washtub of grape-flavored Flavor Aid, laced with potassium cyanide, chloral hydrate, and Valium. There are, behind the table, 11 members of the security detail you joined 8 years ago in San Francisco. They are holding crossbows and rifles. The rifles are pointed at you. In 37 minutes, you will be dead. Your 3 children will already be dead. Your wife will be dead. This is your life as a member of the People's Temple. And the day Jonestown ended, you are born in Indianapolis, Indiana, in the spring of 1942. Your parents are factory workers at the Allison engine plant. They are Methodist, they are kind, they are tired. By the age of 19, you have left their church for the same reason that 19-year-olds in the year 1961 leave most American things. The reason is that the church does not seem to mean what it says. The Lord's Supper is a wafer. The hymns are old. The pastor smokes a pipe and votes Republican. The civil rights movement is on the television every night. The pastor will not speak about it. In the summer of 1965, you are working as a hospital orderly at Indianapolis General. A patient on the cardiac ward, an elderly black woman named Rosa, who has been admitted for a stroke, hands you, on the 3rd afternoon of her admission, a small printed flyer for a church called the People's Temple. She tells you the pastor is a young white man who has integrated his congregation in a city where no white pastor will, and who has taken in 22 black children from the Indiana foster system into his own home. You read the flyer. You attend the next service. The pastor is 26. His name is Jim Jones. He preaches, that Sunday morning, a sermon on the parable of the Good Samaritan. He preaches it in a way no Methodist pastor in Indianapolis has ever preached anything. You drive home in tears. You return the next Sunday. You return every Sunday for the next 2 years. You move with the church to Ukiah, in Northern California, in the summer of 1967. The pastor has begun to preach that nuclear war is coming. The pastor has read, in the journal Esquire, a list of 9 American counties least likely to be affected by Soviet fallout. Ukiah is one of them. The pastor has bought, with the savings of his congregation, a small wooded property outside the town. You move into a converted barn on the property with your young wife and your infant daughter. You begin to work, at the pastor's direction, 6 days a week as a child care assistant in the church's free day school. You stop watching television. You stop reading any newspaper but the church's own. You begin to refer to the pastor in your own internal monologue as Father. You move with the church again in 1971 to a converted Methodist auditorium on Geary Street in San Francisco. The church has, by this point, integrated 3,000 members across Northern California. The congregation is more than 90% black. The leadership is white. The leadership is also, almost without exception, the same dozen white couples who came west from Indianapolis with the pastor in 1967. You are one of those dozen. You are now 30. You are an inner circle member. You are Father's 3rd assistant minister. You attend every Tuesday night the closed-door meeting of the Planning Commission. The Planning Commission decides which members of the congregation are donating enough money. The Planning Commission decides which members are donating their houses. The Planning Commission decides which members will be administered. On which Sunday morning, the church's signature public discipline. The discipline involves one of the inner circle members standing on stage with a leather paddle and striking the offending congregant in front of the entire church. You watch this on more than 50 separate Sunday mornings between 1971 and 1976. You participate on 3 of those Sundays by holding the offending congregant's arms. You travel with Father in October 1973 to the country of Guyana on the northern coast of South America. The pastor has begun to plan a relocation. The reason for the relocation, he tells the inner circle, is that the United States government is preparing, under the Nixon administration, to round up all leaders of integrated congregations and place them in concentration camps. You believe this. You will believe it for the next 5 years. You sign in 1974 a 1,000-acre lease with the Guyanese government for a remote site 24 miles inland from the coastal town of Port Kaituma. The site is dense jungle. There are no roads to it. There is no electricity. There is no running water. The pastor names it, in 1976, the People's Temple Agricultural Project. The congregation, in their letters home, will call it Jonestown. You begin, in 1971, to attend a Tuesday evening Bible study group at the Geary Street auditorium led by the pastor's wife, Marceline. Marceline is, in 1971, a kind woman of 43 who reads the Gospel of Mark slowly and well. You will believe, for several years, that she is the source of the church's moral seriousness, and that her husband is merely the louder voice of a partnership of equals. You will be wrong. You will not understand until 1977 that Marceline has known about her husband's pharmaceutical regimen since 1965 and his sexual practices with the congregation since 1968, and his plan to execute the entire camp in the event of a federal investigation since 1974. You will learn this in a single conversation with her on the dirt floor of her own hut in Jonestown on the night of October 9th, 1978. She will tell you that she has stayed because she does not know any other life. You will tell her you understand. You will be lying. You will not understand. You will, on the night of November 18th, 1978, watch her drink with her husband on the stage of the Central Pavilion before either of them administers a single cup to the congregation. You begin, in 1972, to surrender the contents of your bank account to the church on the first Sunday of every month. The pastor preaches that the only honest disposition of money is collective. The pastor preaches that the only proof of love is full surrender. You believe him. You sign over the title to your house in the Mission District in May 1973. The church sells the house for $46,000 and uses the money to purchase a fleet of Greyhound buses for the congregation's traveling revivals. You and your wife, and your daughter, and your now 2-month-old son move into a single room of the converted Methodist auditorium on Geary Street. You will live in that single room for the next 4 years. You are present on the night of December 14th, 1972, when the first member of the inner circle of the church is publicly disciplined for falling in love with a woman outside the congregation. The man is named Walter. He is 31. The pastor calls him to the stage. The pastor announces to a Sunday night audience of 1,700 members that Walter has revealed himself to be a traitor. The pastor instructs Walter to remove his shirt. Walter does. The pastor instructs another inner circle member to administer 11 strikes with the leather paddle. The strikes are administered. Walter does not cry out. Walter is escorted off the stage by the same security detail who, 6 years later, will be in charge of the Washtub in Guyana. You are watching from the second row. You will see, later that night, in the church kitchen, the welts on Walter's back. You will not say anything. You will go home and sleep. You discover, in 1974, that the pastor has begun to take certain members of the congregation, both male and female, into his private apartment behind the auditorium. The members do not return until the following morning. Some of them weep when they emerge. Some of them do not. The pastor preaches in the next Sunday sermon that the only authentic spiritual love is the love of the prophet for his children, and that the only true children of the prophet are those who have shared his bed. You hear this sermon. You will hear it many times. You will not, in 1974, allow your wife to attend the next traveling revival in Los Angeles, because you have heard rumors. You will tell her you are protecting her. You will be telling the truth. You moved to Jonestown with your wife and your 3 children in the spring of 1977. The conditions on the ground are not what the pastor has described. The huts are too small. The food is rationed. The children are hungry. The pastor lives in a separate cottage with electricity and a refrigerator. The pastor has, in 1977, begun to broadcast over the camp loudspeakers, 24 hours a day, his own voice. The voice reads from Mao's little red book in the morning. The voice reads from the Soviet revolutionary tracks in the afternoon. The voice screams at the camp through the night. You begin to lose sleep. You begin to lose weight. Your children begin to ask, every morning, whether you can go home. You tell them, every morning, that this is home now. You attend, on a Saturday night in March 1978, the first of the events the pastor calls White Nights. The siren goes off at midnight. You and the rest of the camp are summoned to the Central Pavilion. The pastor announces, from the stage, that the camp is under imminent attack by mercenary forces hired by the United States Central Intelligence Agency. He announces that the only honorable response is mass suicide. He distributes to every member a small cup of red liquid. He tells the congregation that the liquid is poison. The congregation drinks. The congregation falls silent. The congregation waits to die. 20 minutes pass. Nothing happens. The pastor announces that this has been a loyalty test. He announces that you have all passed. He announces that the next time the cups are filled, the liquid will not be a test. You return to your hut. Your wife will not look at you that night. Your 7-year-old son asks you, in the dark, whether the next cup will kill him. You tell him no. You are lying to him for the first time in his life. You begin, in the late summer of 1978, to write letters home that you do not send. You write them by candlelight in the corner of your hut after the camp has fallen asleep. You write them to your sister in Indianapolis. You write that the children are losing weight. You write that the pastor has begun to demand that congregation members rehearse every Saturday night at midnight the act of suicide. You write that you are afraid. You write that you do not know how to leave. You burn the letters every Sunday morning, in a small tin can outside your hut, before the camp wakes up. You burn 14 of them between July and November of 1978. You will not show one to your wife. You are afraid she will report you. You will not show one to your mother. You are afraid she has stopped being your mother. The pastor's voice over the camp loudspeakers becomes more incoherent in the autumn of 1978. The pastor begins to slur his words. The medical staff later confirms, in the autopsy of his body, that he had been taking in the last 6 months of his life an escalating combination of pentobarbital, methaqualone, and amphetamines. The voice on the loudspeaker, on certain nights, weeps. The voice, on certain other nights, claims that the pastor is the reincarnation of Vladimir Lenin and Jesus Christ and Akhenaten and Buddha. You hear all of this. You stop in October 1978, allowing your 3-year-old daughter to be left alone with the camp's child care staff. You begin to carry her on your hip every waking hour for the last 3 weeks of her life. A delegation of relatives of Jonestown members forms in San Francisco in the autumn of 1978. The delegation is called the Concerned Relatives. They petition Congressman Leo Ryan of California to investigate the camp. Ryan agrees. He flies, on the afternoon of November 17th, 1978, to Port Kaituma with 3 NBC News journalists, the photographer Greg Robinson, the cameraman Bob Brown, the soundman Steve Sung, and the producer Bob Flick. He lands at Jonestown after dark. He is given a tour. He is offered dinner in the Central Pavilion. The dinner is rehearsed. The pastor, on stage, performs the role of a humble agricultural prophet. The performance is unconvincing. Halfway through the dinner, a member of the camp slips a note into Ryan's hand. The note reads, "Please help us get out of Jonestown." Ryan and the journalists return to the Port Kaituma Airstrip on the afternoon of November 18th to fly home. 16 camp members ask to leave with them. Ryan agrees to take them. As the plane is loading, a group of armed People's Temple security members arrives at the airstrip in a flatbed truck. They open fire on the loading party. They kill Congressman Leo Ryan. They kill the cameraman Bob Brown. They kill the photographer Greg Robinson. They kill the producer Don Harris. They kill one of the defecting Jonestown members, Patricia Parks. The radio call from the airstrip reaches Jonestown at 5:11 in the afternoon. The pastor calls every member of the camp to the Central Pavilion. He climbs the stage. He announces that the time has come. He announces that the United States government will be at the gates of the camp in hours. He announces that the only honorable response is the one you have all rehearsed. The 55-gallon stainless steel washtub is rolled out at 5:14. The pastor instructs the medical staff to administer the contents first to the children, by syringe to those still in arms, and by small paper cup to those who can hold one. You watch this from a folding wooden chair on the dirt floor 20 feet from the stage. You see your 7-year-old son drink. You see your 5-year-old daughter drink. You see your 3-year-old daughter, held by your wife, receive the syringe in her cheek. You see your wife drink. You see your mother drink. The medical staff move to the adults. You stand. You walk forward. You take a small paper cup from a member of the medical staff. You drink it. The taste is grape. You sit down on the dirt floor of the pavilion. You hold your son's hand. He is already gone. You wait. The Guyanese army arrives at Jonestown the morning of November 19th, 1978. They find 909 bodies. 204 of them are children. They find the pastor on the stage with a single bullet through his temple from a small revolver in his right hand. The Guyanese coroner will rule, 6 weeks later, that the pastor's wound was self-inflicted. The American press will, for the next 45 years, refer to what happened on the dirt floor of the Jonestown Pavilion as drinking the kool-aid, despite the fact that the Flavor Aid in the Washtub was a competing brand, and despite the fact that more than 2/3 of the people who drank it on that afternoon were children too young to have chosen anything. This was your life as a member of the People's Temple, the boy from Indianapolis, the third assistant minister, the father of 3 children, the man who held his son's hand on the dirt floor and watched the pavilion go quiet around him.